Welcome to, I'm going to start the show here. Welcome to Week 2, Part 1 of World History since 1500. This week we're going to be looking at the colonial and absolutist revolutions of the 16th through the 18th centuries. We're going to start out with a little anecdote about the Habsburg Jaw. The Habsburg family ruled over the Holy Roman Empire during the time period we're going to be talking about. Last week when we looked at the Protestant Reformation, we discussed how the Holy Roman Empire was really what is today Germany, plus Austria, parts of Italy, Hungary, Bohemia, etc. So the Habsburgs men tended to suffer from prognathism, which is also called the Habsburg jaw. It's where the lower jaw outgrows the upper jaw and therefore juts out. You can see it in the brother of Charles V here in this portrait with his jaw jutting out. Sometimes it could result in things like in the case of Charles V, his mouth was always hanging kind of open and he suffered a speech impediment. Charles II of Spain, it was so bad that he had difficulty chewing. So very oftentimes the Habsburg men grew beards to hide this jaw. Well, they may have had problems with their jaws, but one thing they was wealthy. They had a great deal of power and influence. How did they get that? Let's look at the maternal grandparents of Charles V, Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. And we know Miss Ferdinand and Isabella. They married and formed essentially what today we know as Spain. And they were the ones who financed the voyages of Christopher Columbus. They had a daughter called Joanna the Mad because she had some mental challenges. On the paternal grandparents' side, Maximilian I was Habsburg, the Habsburg dynasty and Holy Roman Emperor, and he had married Mary of Burgundy. They had a son, Philip. Joanna the Mad married Philip, and lo and behold, we get Charles V, who, because of his lineage here, ended up inheriting Spain, the Spanish New World possessions in America, which were huge. Sicily and Naples, Corsica and Sardinia, the Burgundian lands, Austria, etc. This is a portrait by the famous artist Titian of Charles V, who ruled, that's what the R period stands for, from 1519 to 1556. You can see the jaw jutting out, and of course he's grown a beard to hide it. In 1519, the great electors of the Holy Roman Empire, we said that, there were about 7 of those, got together to elect a new Holy Roman Emperor, and Charles V ended up buying more votes. Of course, there were only like 7 votes to buy, but they were expensive votes. Then Francis I of France. Well, Francis I, or Francois I, was of the Valois dynasty. From that point on, certainly Francis I and Charles V never got along. They would war against one another. They would be one another's bêtes noires. Charles V did manage to engage in some very prosperous marriage politics as well. There was nothing like the royalty of the day going ahead and marrying sons and daughters and sisters and brothers off so that they could expand their empire and expand their alliances. Charles V married Isabella of Portugal. Charles V's brother, Ferdinand, married Anne, the sister of King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia. Then Charles V's sister, Mary, married King Louis II of Hungary and Bohemia. So Charles V's family, the Habsburg family, actually had 2 ties to Hungary and Bohemia. And so after a battle there killed the king in 1526, the Habsburgs came to control Hungary and Bohemia as well. How large was their territory? Well, we can see that it included all of Spain. It included Sardinia down here, Sicily, Naples, which was basically about half of Italy, the Austria, parts of what we now know today as the Netherlands. This would have been the area of Burgundy years ago. And, of course, the lands gained by Charles V included Bohemia. We've talked about that, in Hungary. Also Silesia, Moravia, Milan, which is the northern part of Italy. He gained some land over in North Africa as well. States favorable to him are in green, Portugal and England, etc. Enemies are in blue. So Francis I of France, and over here Suleiman the First, the Great of the Ottoman Empire, Suleiman also in North Africa. You can see how Charles V and the Habsburgs were kind of wedged between their enemies. But first, before we talk about that, let's talk about the vast colonial empire that Spain and Charles V had in the New World. And it included several, they divided them up into viceroyalties so that they could govern them more, and they sent over viceroys, essentially governors. The viceroyalty of New Spain included, obviously, parts of what are now the United States, like California, excuse me, and Florida, and New Mexico, and all of that good stuff, and Central America, Mexico and Central America. Then you come down here into the area of Colombia and Venezuela, and you have the Viceroyalty of New Granada, the Viceroyalty of Peru, the Audiencia of Chile, the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, and those were all Spanish territories. Today, many of these areas are Spanish-speaking, and that's why. On the other hand, the Portuguese were on the move and colonizing as well, and they colonized Brazil, and so Portuguese is spoken in Brazil today. We're going to talk about the Aztecs. The Aztecs had a great empire here in Central America, as you see here in Mexico. As you get down into the Yucatan Peninsula, the Mayas were ruling here. And the Incas down in the Andes Mountains, we'll also talk about them today. So let's talk just a very little bit about the colonial Latin America, who was there before the Spanish came. We usually refer to Latin America during the time of the Aztecs, the Incas, and the other Indian empires as Mesoamerica, M-E-S-O, Mesoamerica. In the 16th century, there were about 25 million people living in Mexico. And coinciding with this great wave of Spanish exploration and colonization and conquest, the Aztecs ruled over the largest empire in Mesoamerica. Their capital city was Tenochtitlan, which is now Mexico City. By 1519, it had a population of perhaps 150,000 to 200,000 people. That was huge for those days. Located on an island, the city had great canals, buildings of impressive scale, particularly temple pyramids. Like all Mesoamerican peoples, the Aztecs did not have horses. There had been horses in ancient times in the New World, but they had died out. It would be the Spanish who brought horses back to the New World. The Aztecs used their pyramids as temples, and some for human sacrifice. Sometimes those human sacrifices were performed by literally cutting out the living heart. One dedication of a temple in 1487 may have included the sacrifice of over 80,000 victims. The leader of the Aztecs was Montezuma II, who ruled 1502 to 1520. The Spanish, led by the conqueror, the conquistador Hernán Cortés, attempted to end the Aztec practice of human sacrifice, and after conquering them in the years 1519 to 1521, he ordered their capital destroyed. Now, the Spanish conquered the Aztecs, who greatly outnumbered them, and the Spanish only had 600 men. They were successful for many reasons. One was the Aztec fear of the return of their god Quetzalcoatl, and at first they mistook Hernán Cortés for Quetzalcoatl. Secondly, the Spanish had great military superiority, cannons, guns, etc. Third, the Spanish brought with them European diseases to which the Aztecs had no immunity and which decimated the Aztecs. And fourth and finally, not all of the tribute peoples who were under the Aztecs, other Indians liked the Aztec rule, and so there was internal revolt among tribute peoples of the Aztecs. If we remember what we talked about last week, where you have a weakening of the core of a civilization, in this case, tribute peoples revolting, diseases decimating the population, and then you have an external strength which is invading, namely the Spanish, then you have implosion. So no wonder that the Aztecs were conquered. Likewise, the Incas. In the 1430s AD, the Incas of Peru began the expansion of their empire. By the time of their conquest by the Spaniard conquistador Francisco Pizarro in 1532 to 1535, their empire stretched 2,500 miles from southern Colombia into central Chile and included about 1.3 million people. Their ruler was called the Inca, and they believed that the first Inca came from the region of Lake Titicaca in modern Bolivia. Their civilization witnessed the construction of impressive roads, pyramids, bridges, aqueducts, fountains, baths, etc. However, they did not have a writing system, nor did they have the wheel, iron, or money when the Spaniards arrived. They too practiced human sacrifice, but on a much smaller scale than that of the Aztecs. One of the most spectacular and well-preserved Inca sites is the beautiful mountain city of Machu Picchu. The Spanish, with only 175 men, were successful in conquering the Incas for many reasons. Again, some of those would have included the belief that the Inca god had returned, Virocha, and of course he had not, and internal revolt. So again, implosion. And, the Spanish obviously had guns and cannons and so forth. So, actually, the Spanish in this case had one cannon when they attacked. Implosion occurred and they fell. Now, because the Portuguese were also moving into the New World, Spain and Portugal agreed in 1494 to a treaty named Tordesillas. And by this treaty, a line was drawn from the North Pole to the South Pole, about 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. And the end result of that is, in practical terms, that divided Latin America up in such a way that Portugal got undisputed title to Brazil. We can talk just a little bit about the Columbian Exchange. The Columbian Exchange refers to food, animals, diseases, culture, etc. that were exchanged between the Old World and the New World. For instance, the New World brought to the Old World of Europe crops. New World crops included tobacco, so the Europeans did not have tobacco from earliest times. They did not have rubber. The New World brought maize, that's corn, white potatoes, sweet potatoes, tomatoes. Imagine in Italy without tomato sauce. Cocoa, peanuts, chili peppers, squashes, pumpkins, papaya, avocados, pineapples, and many kinds of beans, lima beans, butter beans, pole beans, kidney beans, navy beans, snap beans, and even string beans. Imagine how dull and boring and monotonous and not very healthy the European diet was before all of these wonderful things came from the New World. The New World Indians also gave us tamales and tortillas and a chocolate drink. The Old World had some of its own plants, which it brought to the New World. Oranges, bananas, wheat, rice, grapes, olives, sugar, bluegrass, daisies, and dandelions. The New World had the disease of syphilis, which the Europeans had not seen before. Old World diseases included smallpox and typhus and measles, all of which, of course, the Indians had no immunity to. The Old World also brought many animals to the New World, including the horse, ass, ox, pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats. Now, we're going to be discussing this week absolutism. And absolutism is what it sounds like. It's where a ruler, a king, an emperor rules absolutely and with little regard for anyone else or any other institutions like parliament or any other kinds of diets or groups. On the other hand, we're going to eventually look here in the next couple weeks at places like Holland, that is the Netherlands, and England and so forth, whose corporative institutions, in the case of England like Parliament, will be more important than their kings and monarchs. So on the one hand, you have countries that are going to be ruled under absolutism by absolute monarchs. And then you're going to have other countries that we're going to see that are ruled with corporative institutions, and those are just groups of people and institutions that have influence. They might be churches, they might be labor groups later on in history, not at this point in time, and they might be things like parliament, diets, estates general, etc. And then there are going to be some places that have a combination of both. And Latin America was one of those places where they had both operating. So you had the crown, you had the king, that is the Spanish king. You had the colonists, that is, all the people settling the land and the conquerors, the conquistadors, etc. And you had the church. And sometimes they all didn't get along, and very oftentimes the crown would try to act as the mediator, especially between the colonists and the church. Meanwhile, the colonists largely controlled the Indians of Latin America through what was called the encomienda system. Now, the encomienda system was a formal grant of land to a Spanish colonist, and it included control of the Indian inhabitants of that land. So if you were the owner of an encomienda, you could demand tribute. It might be gold or silver or, whatever the Indians had, and certainly they didn't have gold and silver for very long, but crops. They also could demand labor service from the Indians. And in exchange, the people who owned the encomiendas were to provide for military protection and Christianization of the Indians. Now, in reality, the encomienda system made virtual slaves of many of the Indians. And in practice, the Indians, many of them were bought and sold and literally worked to death. As we said, the Spanish crown administered its New World possessions through viceroys or governors, and the four main ones were New Spain, Peru, New Granada, and La Plata. The viceroys tended to preside over an audiencia, and an audiencia was a group of 12 to 15 judges who served as an advisory council to the viceroy. And besides an advisory council, they were also the highest judicial body. Now, one of the most important things that the Spanish crown claimed was the quinto, and the quinto was 1/5 of all precious metals mined in the Americas, mainly gold and silver. They would belong to the Spanish crown, so it just poured gold and silver into Spanish hands. Now, on the one hand, then, you have the crown, and on the other hand, you have the colonists, and then you also have the church. And many of the priests, the Franciscans and Jesuit order priests who came to the New World, grew up in a tradition of humanism that was then sweeping Spain. Humanism felt that, Europe had gotten a lot of things wrong, and that this New World would be like a utopia, a possible utopia, and a chance for people to get things right and to set up civilization in a way that the inhabitants of the New World, the Indians, could be civilized, taught, humanized, reformed. Many of these humanist priests or friars saw this as an opportunity to realize utopia and set up what we would term socialist communities, where the property was owned in common by the Indians, who performed labor, sold the results, the goods of their labor and shared it among all of the Indians and even had representative government. Well, needless to say, a lot of the colonists and even sometimes the Crown did not especially like these communally owned properties that were overseen by Jesuit priests mainly. An interesting fellow who appeared was Bartolomé de las Casas, a Franciscan priest and missionary, but before he experienced a conversion in 1514 and became a priest, he was a colonist who owned an encomienda, and he looked around him and he saw how the Indians were treated, and he was just abhorred by it all. And he renounced his encomienda, he gave it up, he became a priest and later on a bishop, and he spent years writing, trying to influence the Spanish king to free the Indians from the encomienda system. Emperor Charles V, who was interested in curbing the power of the colonists, listened to Bartolomé de las Casas and others when he established the new laws of the Indies in 1542. And that essentially ended Indian enslavement, at least on paper. Sometimes it was more difficult to actually enforce that. It was also to prevent the encomiendas from being inherited from father to son. That actually didn't work out in the end because some of the colonists rose in rebellion and they had to come up with a compromise or an agreement. So Bartolomé de las Casas became Bishop of Chiapas and did a lot of good work in supporting the Indians and their rights. The Indians were overworked. They fell prey to European diseases. Again, these European diseases spread as all diseases do, like flus and so forth do in our country today and all over the world, or like the Black Death spread through medieval Europe. No one is purposely trying to cause the spread of disease. Disease just spreads, and either you have an immunity to it or not. The Indians did not have an immunity to European diseases like smallpox, so their population was just decimated. In 1570, Peru, as we said, with the Incas, had 1.3 million Indians. 50 years later, only 600,000 Indians. Mexico in 1519, when the conquest began, had over 25 million Indians. And by 1605, which is 86 years later, only 1 million Indians. Needing more laborers, Charles V in 1518 introduced into Spanish Latin America the slave trade from Africa. The Portuguese brought also black slaves to Africa, about 4,000 annually by 1600. Under Charles V's son, Philip II, who had fiscal problems, there was more of a rapprochement with the colonial oligarchies in Latin America, and they were given increasingly greater control over the Indians on their estates and encomiendas. And the last thing we want to say about Latin America is from Latin America, explorers like Hernando de Soto set out in his case in 1539 to lead expeditions elsewhere, actually set out from northern Florida to go to the Mississippi River in search of silver and gold. The Indians were always telling the Spanish there's silver and gold, etc., here and there. And of course, this spread then disease further into, in this case, North America. Well, we started out, and we have been talking about Charles V, and I've Adobe Photoshopped in a couple of images from Google. Over here we see Francis I of France. Over here we see Suleiman the Great of the Ottoman Empire. And in between we see poor old Charles V caught in a vise. See the vise here? And then somebody's working the vise. They're screwing the vise in so that the poor guy is being squeezed. I always say that Charles V was caught in a vise between Francis I of France and Suleiman the Magnificent. And he ruled Suleiman, the Islamic Ottoman Empire. In fact, exhausted by warfare, disillusioned by the Protestant Reformation, Charles V finally abdicated in 1556, dividing his lands between his brother Ferdinand, who became Holy Roman Emperor and ruled Austria, and his son Philip II, who's got a lot of land, ruled Spain, the Spanish Netherlands, and the Spanish possessions in the New World. Charles V and Francis I of France would fight 4 wars against one another. Francis I was always trying to get some of the possessions that Charles V had in Italy, etc. And then finally, by the Treaty of Cateau Cambresis in 1559, the two settled their differences, and 2 important things happened in this treaty. Number 1, France agreed to give up her claim to Italy. And number 2, Philip II, the Habsburg king, married Elizabeth of Valois, daughter of Henry II of France. So actually, now you have the Valois family and the Habsburg family getting married. The other big enemy of Charles V was the Ottoman Empire, and you see how it stretched. Originally, it starts out here around 1300 in what is now Turkey, and it spread, and so by 1566 it was in all of this green area, and then it had tributary states, states that paid it tribute, and those are shown in pink. Well, it really expanded into Europe because the official dividing line between Europe and Asia is right up here. And if you see Istanbul here, it's at the Straits of the Bosphorus, which are between the Sea of Marmara and the Black Sea. And then right here you see the Dardanelles Straits between the Aegean Sea and the Sea of Marmara. That is the dividing line between Europe on this side and Asia on this side. This is Turkey currently, and of course this is all the Middle East. So the Ottoman Turks were Islamic, and they were moving out of the area of Turkey. And 47 years before the start of this class in 1500, a very important event occurred. And that is the capital of the old Byzantine Empire, or the old Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople, fell to the Ottoman Turks. And the Ottoman Turks, of course, were Islamic. And some of the Europeans felt that they no longer wanted to enrich the Islamic Ottomans by continuing to go ahead and trade with them. So that was one of the reasons why, Christopher Columbus and other people, started to sail west to try to get around the Ottoman Empire so they wouldn't have to pay, tribute to them when goods went through the Ottoman Empire. You can see that the Ottoman Turks really began to expand. In the 1450s, they expanded into Europe, into what is now Serbia. In the 1460s, into Europe, Bosnia and Herzegovina. They fought a war between themselves and Venice from 1463 until 1479, and basically continued their expansion into Europe itself. And one of the important battles that occurred was 1526, when Suleiman and his forces, and at that time they were in an alliance with France, with Francis I of France. So you can see now they're both attacking the Habsburgs. But in that alliance, they attacked the Habsburgs at the plains of Mohawks in 1526. Suleiman at that time defeated the Hungarians, and King Louis II, who, as we said, was related 2 times by marriage to Charles V. Louis II was killed in that battle. Eventually, Charles V's brother, Ferdinand, became King of Hungary and defended the lands, successfully defeated Suleiman when he tried to siege the Habsburg capital at Vienna. And meanwhile, Charles tried to head off Turkey's advances in the Mediterranean by attacking North Africa. In 1535, in fact, Charles V took Tunis, but he failed to take much more in North Africa. Well, as we said, Charles V would eventually just go ahead and abdicate, give up his throne. He was tired. And Philip II, his son, would take over Spain and the Spanish New World possessions. We see him on the left, and his palace, San Lorenzo de El Escorial, above. Philip II ruled 1556 to 1598, and some of the things he's known for is he acquired the Philippine Islands for Spain. They were named after him. And in the Spanish, what were called the Spanish Netherlands, there was a revolt under Philip II, and the northern provinces became Protestant, declaring their independence from Spain to form the new nation of Holland. This is going to be very important because the Dutch and Holland will become very, very important in world history. The southern provinces remained under Spain and were called the Spanish Netherlands. But there's something that really is interesting about the revolt of the Netherlands. And there you see the area in revolt against Spanish rule, etc., all depicted in this map. And that is, by the time Philip II died in 1598, 2/3 of the Spanish government's revenues, now those included all of the silver and gold pouring in from the New World, 2/3 of the Spanish government's revenues were swallowed up by interest on the royal debt. Interest, not by interest on the royal debt. And much of that debt had been incurred by the expenses of fighting the war and the revolt in the Netherlands. And as you can see, they lost half of the Netherlands anyhow. So you can begin to see now how revolts can literally begin to decimate the treasury of a country. We also want to talk just a little bit about Philip II and his foreign policy. Philip II had been married to Mary Tudor, who ruled England from 1553 to 1558. And she was called Bloody Mary. She was Catholic and she persecuted Protestants, hence her name. When she died in 1558, her half-sister, Elizabeth, ascended to the throne of England. But everything was not copacetic. Mary Stuart was a first cousin once removed of Elizabeth. She was Queen of Scotland, and she was next in line for the English throne. She was the widow of Francis II of France, and she returned to the British Isles in 1561, claiming to be both Queen of Scotland and Queen of England. She and other English Catholics claimed that Elizabeth, because of the divorce from Catherine of Aragon, was an illegitimate child of her father and should not be ruling. Well, interestingly enough, back in Scotland, where Mary Stuart is and was queen, Scotland was itself becoming Protestant, and it was under the influence of John Knox, who was a Calvinist and who is associated with the Presbyterian Church. Now, Mary, Queen of Scots, kind of put just up with the Presbyterian Church. She herself remained Catholic, etc. And she did not try, when she was in Scotland, to persecute the Protestant Church or to restore Catholicism, although, again, she remained herself Catholic. Mary Stuart married her cousin, Henry Lord Darnley, who was next in line after Mary to the English throne. So you can imagine what Mary's doing. She's trying to set up, that, whatever children of hers, or she or her children, will become the next ruler of England. Now, Darnley was intensely jealous of Mary's Italian secretary, David Rizzio, and had a part in having that secretary murdered. Well, Mary had had by this time enough of her husband's scheming, and she worked with a man called James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, to conspire to assassinate her husband, Henry Lord Darnley. And it all was very mysterious. Henry was at a castle. There was an explosion. His body wasn't found in the exploded castle itself. It was found far away from the castle. No one really knows exactly what happened. But within a short time, Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, and people began to talk. They called her a whore and a murderess. She lost popularity with her Presbyterian subjects. She was taken and imprisoned in a Scottish castle. She escaped to England, and Elizabeth, her half-sister, imprisoned her there. And while she was in prison, Mary Queen of Scots developed plot after plot against her half-sister, Elizabeth. And Elizabeth never really did anything about it. I mean, she could have possibly had her executed, but some people think that Elizabeth feared the reaction of Philip II of Spain if something happened to Mary Queen of Scots. Philip II of Spain was over there in Spain thinking, well, you know, Mary Stuart, Mary Queen of Scots, is Catholic, and if Elizabeth dies, she or, you know, one of her issue will become the next King, Queen of England, in which case England will become Catholic again. Meanwhile, in 1580, Philip II also became King of Portugal, and with this acquisition, he increased his capacity to attack England by sea. Finally, after many schemes from her prison, Mary Queen of Scots was definitely implicated in what is called the Babington Conspiracy. There was no doubt in Elizabeth's mind now that Mary was conspiring against her. Elizabeth was still reluctant to sign Mary's death warrant. At one point, Elizabeth suggested that someone might quietly do Mary in, but no one volunteered for the task. So finally, Elizabeth signed the death warrant, and Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed in 1587. And some say this helped galvanize Philip II's final resolve to go ahead with his plan called the Enterprise of England, whereby he sent an armada of ships to England. Philip's plan was brilliant, really, that the Spanish Armada should sail into the English Channel, meet, and if possible, defeat the English fleet. And as a cover from the Netherlands, the Duke of Parma would cross over from the Netherlands with his troop, cross over the English Channel. The invasion of the Spanish Armada was to be in July of 1588, and a terrible storm hit. The English ships were lighter and more maneuverable. They had better weapons with a longer range, and so the unheard of really happened, and the great Spanish Armada was defeated. Of course, this doesn't mean that Spain is defeated, but this was a major blow to the Spanish, and sort of points out how now Elizabeth, pictured here, and the English would start the ascendancy. As we'll find out, Spain was having problems. It was having financial problems. It had too large of a debt. It was not proceeding in reforms like Northern Europe was. To be continued in Part 2. Thank you.